Our original idea was that the FM would be here by now, but he's still in the Rajya Sabha defending the budget. So we'll move straight to the question and answers, and then we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to kick things off by perhaps asking the first question, taking advantage of both.
Before you do that, can you send a message to His Excellency, the Finance Minister, to say, I promise not to repeat the lecture if he comes?
I don't think that's his concern at all. He's sent 3 messages to me already saying he's really very sorry, but he has a queue that he has to go through. So perhaps, please raise your hand if you have a question. I will ask you in turn. Perhaps I might start off by asking Partha what should be the way in which statistical offices might take this idea of wealth and the measurement of wealth on board, and what might be the baby steps they might take, given the problem both of measuring quantities and even more so of prices.
Right.
And taking advantage particularly of Dr. TCA Anand, the just retired Secretary of Statistics and Program Implementation, who is with us. He's gone back to academic life, so he can now tell us and tell his parent organization of the past what to do. But first, Partha.
Well, it really is very difficult for me to answer that question, given that TCA is sitting right here. We were members of the same committee, and I was guided by him for the 3 years we wrote. Let me give you, broadly speaking, how I think I read him, and he can then correct me, of course. He had in mind the fact, pretty much all the qualifications that I made, TCA found to be very reasonable. In fact, I understood the qualifications by having conversations with him. We had the beauty of what his contribution was to suggest there are certain things that we could do to bring in assets into as a satellite set of accounts, which could be done in a year. There'll be some which can be done, in his judgment, maybe 2 years, 3 years, some which could be done in 5 years, and so forth. And he had a picture of that in mind. And then, of course, I kept on saying, well, don't forget to mention that there will be a whole bunch which will never be there. But you just have to recognize that it's not there. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just that you can't write down quantitatively. But you could, as I was suggesting, talk about qualitative changes in the asset, in the portfolio, particularly over ecosystems. Wetlands come to mind because they are very prominent in India, but ponds, lakes, rivers, estuaries, and so forth. These are momentous sets of capital assets. Hundreds of millions of people's lives depend on a daily basis. We don't have an account of that. So it's a progressive way of going about it, in progression, so to speak. And TCA could, if you so inclined, suggest what kind of assets could be introduced into the. I mean, oil and natural gas is pretty straightforward, largely because they have market prices, and you have data on, at least on their stocks underground, that sort of thing. Those are the easy bits. The really hard bits are ecosystem services. That's really hard. It's hard for us. It's not hard for the farmers, by the way. You could ask farmers about the frequency with which pollinators are arriving on an annual basis, that sort of thing. There are qualitative data of that sort in various parts of the world. But these are all going to be location-specific. So another problem is that you can't borrow numbers from another part of the world and lift them here. By the way, this has a sort of this is something, to me, it's a very important thing. This location specificity is, to me, one of the most beautiful aspects of the economics of natural capital, which is to do with the fact that the Director General was kind enough to mention Sandhi, the South Asian Network for Development in Environmental Economics, which was founded about 20 years ago for South Asian countries, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and now Bhutan as well, was that young people trained locally in various parts, maybe Orissa, maybe Madhya Pradesh, or wherever, they, if they're really keen on the subject, will have a comparative advantage over their counterparts in Harvard or MIT or Cambridge, because they will have some knowledge of the institutions in their background, in their back door, as well as some of the problems that they face, which the Harvard professor would haven't the faintest, he wouldn't even know that such a question exists. So that comparative advantage we can build on. That's the one created, to me as a teacher, of course, that was fantastic. Because I could put up some really superb papers that was published in this journal, as well as in places like PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, because there was real original stuff out there of some generality. The flip side is, of course, it means that a lot of this work is going to be localized. You can't just lift what happens in a wetland in Ghana and bring it over here and then say, because the wetland in Ghana is a different wetland from a wetland in Madhya Pradesh, if there is a wetland there. Okay. So the specificity is a very, very important thing to bear in mind. And I think that is one reason why we're going to be always very askance at national accounts that have these wealth components, because they will have a very, very specific nature to it. A pond in Orissa is different from a pond in Kerala, and so forth. Okay.
There's a question there. Can we have a microphone, please?
I'm Vinesh Sharma. My basic question is that don't you feel that the wealth of nation today is too much dependent on Fed, interest rates, it is too much over sensitive to interest rates, financial markets, equity markets. Right now the volatility going on in Dow Jones and all, bond yields, etc. That is and not basically based on the sound structural or on the productivity based. It is too much based, even after this 2008 financial crisis, it is too much, dependent on hot money. So don't you feel that it has to be a lot more based on sound fundamentals, rather than on and what about the measurement of things like intellectual property and etc. also, they are also basically have a very, very sort of a very invisible type of sort of wealth measurement. So how do you measure that soundly?
I think the question had to do with what financial markets are doing.
Sensitivity to interest rates, right now, and to the central banks, it is too much dependent on.
So it's not so much about the topic that is being discussed, but it is a general question about financial markets and the volatility that's created, and the interest rate sensitivity. So I guess it does have a connection.
I should mention there will be some. I'm talking about the real economy here. These are real capital assets. I don't mean that's an artificial economy. I'm simply saying that financial capital is not a separate type of capital asset. Okay, it's, if you could say, it's fungible. It's embedded in a piece of, you own a stock, let us say. That stock has a price. It could be converted into various forms of capital assets, but it's just a holding mechanism. So don't keep financial capital as part of this sector at all. It's an accounting device. That's one thing. From our point of view, I'm looking at the real economy. You might ask about social capital and institutions. Where do they fit in? And where they fit in here, in this scheme of things, is they enable the assets which make for the productive capacity to move from one place to another. The portfolio problem is being influenced by the state of the economy, state of society. Well, one way of thinking about it would be the following. Do a pure mental experiment, Gedanken experiment, as they used to say. You think of two economies which are identical, absolutely identical in terms of the fabric of stuff, all the capital assets, manufactured capital, households, you name it. For every item here, there's a corresponding item here, and for every item here, there's a corresponding item there. Absolutely the same. But in one, people trust one another, and the other people distrust one another. Well, you're going to say, well, the two economies are going to take off in two different ways. The one where they trust, presumably, they will be willing to exchange if they find that there are some gains to be had, and so forth. Never mind whether they're markets or not, but they will be able to do some deals, if nothing else. And so the trajectories of the two economies will be very different. And yet they have the same set of assets to begin with. So the question arises, did they have the same wealth? No, they didn't, because the value of those assets were different in the two. In the one where people don't trust one another, these assets were probably lying around there in the household. They don't know what to do with it because they can't trade with anybody else. You've got 3 or 4 tables. You can't sell the tables and get something else from somebody else. So notions like religious capital, social capital, cultural capital are the fabric, if you like, the medium in which an economy functions. So they will be influencing the accounting prices of them. But financial capital is not separate. It's totally separate from this. It's a different, you're looking at a different sector, and it's a enabling sector. Okay.
Question here, the lady in the third row. No, not that lady. Oh, that one first. Ma'am, do you also have a question? Oh, good.
So,
Come to you.
my name is Preeti Agarwal, and I'm doing my PhD at Center for Trade and Development. My PhD topic is measuring sustainability of India's growth. So, for the first chapter, I have measured the wealth estimates for India. And as you said, it's not an easy job, and I'm facing a lot of problems with respect to that. Now, for forests mainly, when I look at forest wealth in India, and I take the data on forest cover in India, it is showing to be increasing over time every 2 years. And what I feel is mainly it's driven by plantations. So can there be a way to account for native forest? Because if native forests are degrading and it's being replaced by plantations, it is not, it's actually our wealth is degrading in some sense. So can there be a way to account for native forests apart, like quantitative way? Like qualitatively, I can always mention that there are studies which have said that native forest is declining, but quantitatively, can I account for that?
So could you just hold the microphone closer? I also couldn't hear you very clearly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
Shall I repeat the question?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the first chapter of my PhD is measuring the wealth of India. So a part of that is forest wealth, which I have tried to measure. But for forests, I am mainly facing the problem that over time, the Forest Survey of India shows that forest cover in India is expanding. And most of it is driven by increase in plantations. And the native forest is declining. So I'm at a loss as in how to account for decline in native forest, because that's where the ecological significance lies.
Thank you.
Very good. I mean, I never did you any harm, so why do you ask me such difficult questions? Thank you very much. No, that's a very good question. But you already have the answer implicit in the question. If the native forest is to be seen as a different object from secondary tertiary forests in the same place, then they are separate assets, and they will have different prices. And that's a very fair way of going about it. At the end of the day, it's a matter of, it's an art rather than a science. I think you're dead right. We ought to be thinking about it. Because you might ask the question as to whether native forests have certain virtues that tertiary ones don't, and vice versa, by the way. The flip side happens as well. It could be that it's nurturing, it's a habitat for species which have evolved over thousands and thousands of years, if not millions of years. And if you can establish that, then boy, you really have it. Because what you're saying is that native forest is a different stock. And even if you think of it as in terms of biomass, if that's your unit, you still can say, well, this is biomass of native forest has a different price from biomass of a secondary forest. Once you're following that route, your economic nose will tell you which way to go. That's not a problem. It's not putting numbers, that's a different matter. But your intuition is exactly right.
Gentleman in the third row first. Can you just, in the corner seat here in the third? Yeah. Yes, you please. Thank you.
You know, ecological systems can take a lot of insult. We have from 1.6 billion people in 1900 to almost 7 point something. So rather than going into year to year losses and estimating them, the most critical thing may be the threshold levels beyond which they will become beyond which it will become irreparable damage. So are there any methodologies to look at the threshold levels, because that may be more critical for the long-term survival of even human race on the planet?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, that's absolutely valid. So I kept on talking about natural capital, and my examples were wetlands, forests, ponds, and so forth. But what kind of objects are they? And that's the basis of the question that the gentleman has asked, is really, what are the dynamics of a wetland? What are the dynamics, natural dynamics of a pond? Now, those of you who have a garden pond will know the dynamics very well. On certain days, the water is clear, and there you can see the little fish in it and everything. And on very muggy days, it suddenly becomes, can't see the water, through the water, because it's full of algae. The quality has changed, and so forth. Now, ecologists, mathematical ecologists, have tons of work on that in trying to model the dynamics of natural capital. So we have to think of the biosphere, and that's implicit in the question that was asked. We have to think of the biosphere as a mesh of, if you like, self-regenerative resources, like a tree, like a pond, which has some finite capacity, obviously, because the Earth size is finite, natural, it's finite, but each year it churns out biomass. Let's use biomass as our currency, okay? Each year it churns it out. I mean, in a forest you have the tree, the leaves fall, or even in the temperate areas the leaves fall each year. There's biomass production going on. And so with the bird population, some birds die, others are born, and so forth. So again, there is a self-regenerative thing. But, and that was the point of the question, is that if you take more than the rate at which it is producing, I mean, if you mean the human society, then of course the stock declines. Because, as I remember the example of the tree, you let it loose, it grows. But it's not going to grow forever. It's going to go to some maximum height and so forth, and it'll have an age, 200 years, 100 years, whatever, and it'll have a natural death, and it'll be replaced, presumably, by competitors, the next generation of tree or whatever. You can model that. It's a fiercely difficult area to model in detail because you have systems which are operating at different speed and at different scale. So think of the garden pond on the one hand, and you have a huge lake on another. They have different spatial scales altogether. And in each of these, you have lots and lots of sub-ecosystems at work. A patch of population here, a patch of population there, a bit of migration every now and then, and so forth and so on. You can still conceptualize it. And the idea here, the question really here is that there will be a maximum amount that you can take annually out of it and convert it to other purposes. Because if you do more than that, then the entire stock will shrink. That will be disinvestment, negative investment. Well, how long can it shrink? Well, of course, zero is one possibility. That's the one. But the question is subtler because it's saying, no, it can shrink. It can be doomed even before it hits zero, because you need a minimum size before it can actually operate within which. And that's the question. And of course, we have done damage like that umpteen times onwards. No question about that. So the entire intellectual apparatus of economics, even those who work with natural capital, and there are some now, quite a number here even, see it as a portfolio problem. And saying, well, say 25 years ago, I remember distinctly I'm having rather heated discussion with colleagues of mine at MIT. We used to know each other well. They respected me, I respected them. My own respect for them actually declined a bit, but never mind. It was, Partha, what are you complaining about? We're substituting other forms of capital assets for the ones we are taking away. So what's the beef? So this notion that you can substitute your way out of problems is absolutely embedded in our psyche. And the reason the questions are extremely important one is saying, well, look, there are limits to that, because it's all very well to say that we've got tons and tons of building material out there. Buildings, you name the stuff, we've got it, computers and so forth, we can hardly breathe. That's not going to be very useful. Or the disease vectors, which are being kept at bay through the natural processes, are now galloping away because the predators of these diseases are shrinking to uselessness. That can happen in the visible case with hawks. The bird life that we don't care about very much because they're scavengers. Well, they're doing enormous amount of service for us on a daily basis, keeping disease vectors at bay and so forth. So this question is extremely important, what you've just now asked. And the answer is, how would you proceed then from that? Well, as the stock declines, its accounting price goes up. That's how it happens. It should go up because it becomes more scarce. And so if it becomes more scarce, then at the margin, any further deterioration of that stock will look bad for your wealth accumulation. Okay, because the price is very high and you're now declining it. So the intuition is exactly as the proposition, that wealth index that I just now mentioned previously, that equation. Remember, the delta K could be negative. That's the case that you're thinking of. Delta Ki is negative. Now, if Pi is very large, then a small negative delta K would still be a large number, and that will bring down your wealth estimate. And that's exactly what we want. We want to be able to say that our portfolio of assets is taking such a shape that at the margin there are certain extremely valuable assets that need to be kept intact. Otherwise, you're in danger. Now, this has happened at the national level, maybe not so much, because people can move in principle and so forth. But at the village level, people like Kanchan Chopra, Narpat Jodha have done pioneering work in showing how you get completely locked in. You're in this small village area, and your the management structure has been such that certain assets have really declined. What do you do then? You can't say, well, go and substitute. Substitute into what? Intuitionally, you might say, well, educate the kids so they can leave. But there is just so much of leave you can make. I mean, where do you go? In Africa, we now see some serious difficulties with ecological disasters happening of the kind that you've just now mentioned, where essentially the productivity of the local ecosystems has gone down to the extent that people have to leave. Trouble is, they haven't very many places to go to. They get killed if they go to places too far away, and then they're not exactly invited. So there are problems within problems within problems. But at the conceptual level, that's what wealth is doing. It's giving you a value of each of the assets in your portfolio.
The lady here in the fourth row, please. Here. If you just stand up, then he will give it to you. Thank you.
Professor Dasgupta, firstly, I bring you greetings from Anantha, who's sorry not to be attending the lecture today. Anantha Durayappa. Can you hear me?
Can you just hold the microphone a little closer?
I said I bring you greetings from Anantha Durayappa, who's sorry to be missing the lecture today.
Anantha Durayappa.
Anantha?
Yes, of course.
Yes. And my question actually is from a rather different angle. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and I study the brain. And the notion of well-being in neuroscience has actually now begun to suggest, based on neurobiological evidence, that it's really the training of the rational intelligence along with the socio-emotional skills, specifically compassion, which will really lead to well-being and human flourishing. So would you think or envisage that in the future economists might consider including the notion of a compassion capital also as an investment in their equations?
Well, that's very, very interesting. Well, let me, before, I have very little to say because for the reason that I have to come to. There is a good deal when I talk about the PI, capital PI, as the accounting price. I think implicitly the way I've been structuring my talk, If I have, I apologize, but I have a feeling from that particular question that I may have gone in one direction too much, in that I'm looking at the functional value of natural capital, of all the capital assets, the functional value. What does it do for us? Okay. If I look at a wetland, I'm thinking about the purification of water that it provides us with, and so forth. So that's a good thing. But there's now a very interesting, rich literature talking about, which has gone into empirical literature, which has gone into the question of the fact that people are happier in a more natural environment than in a concrete environment. I mean concrete in the literal sense here now. There is some beginnings of a literature which is quite convincing. Gresham Daly is one of the leading experts in this field. People have done actually even experiments as to how you feel if you can take walks if not in the countryside, but certainly wooded area. So the urban planning is now being influenced a bit along those lines, that there should be green spaces and everything. So the idea here is that actually in some sense they are good for one's soul. We don't use the word soul anymore, but you get the meaning. The problem that I think I have with your suggestion about compassionate is that I suppose it's hard being a Democrat, let me put it this way. And I'm a die-hard Democrat, and I have great difficulty because there are many things people don't listen to and so forth I disapprove of, and yet if I'm a Democrat, that's how it is. That's how it is. You have to live with it. You have one vote, and you can write articles, but if they don't read it, what can you do? You can't force them to read it, right? So directed societies I have problems with. I think this is the right kind of research to be able to show that people are better off. Sense of well-being is enhanced if they have a garden or if there's a place where they can, public parks. Urban development in the United States, certainly, and United Kingdom, certainly, is occasionally sympathetic to this view, but the pressure of population, as you were pointing out, and the pressure of the fact that people want to become richer, makes for zoning very difficult. So more and more green space is being given over to urban development because people want housing and so forth. So there's always a tension there. And you can then point to the fact that we need to curb in rich countries, certainly, curb our consumption level. But it has to be done democratically, and that's why I have a problem. I'm not sure I know how to think about directed political movements. Capitalism, some would say it's cutthroat anyway. But on the other hand, there are checks and balances of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Capitalism isn't just it's not a cowboy economy in principle. You're curtailed by property rights, you're curtailed by quality control, you're curtailed by a whole lot of honest trading and so forth. There's a huge fabric of legal structure underlying capitalism. And that might not make us better people, but it might keep us from doing harm to others, as a bare minimum. So, yes and no. I know that's not a satisfactory answer.
Could we have the gentleman here in the front, please? T.C. Anand.
Thanks, Partha. I was listening to you and I'm very fascinated at something which you have not elaborated on. I think prices seem to be playing a very important role in the manner in which you are dealing with a lot of these issues. Because my original question was actually on social capital, and you embedded that in prices, and all these network things, the thing with the lady just asked about compassion ethics, also gets embedded in prices, and so on. What worries me is that we then make it virtually impossible to actually concretize what these prices will be, because they could become too difficult to measure, and there would be too many different things. Because in a sense, now they differ from society to society, they may well differ from individual to individual. So what exactly then are we looking for? The economist's notion of prices is something which is commonly accepted by all of us. So how here we are having very idiosyncratic prices?
Yeah. That's a very good question. It's very related to this. Obviously, I think I guarded myself warning us all not to take these inequalities literally in the sense of, that's it. If you can't fit it into that, then forget it. I wasn't taking that position at all. The reason I did it in this way is that this is the clean, complete way of doing it. And then you step back and then unravel it, saying, well, the PIs aren't going to be there for many, many assets and so forth. So that's for sure. The idea that prices may be person-specific, not just good-specific, is not new. The whole theory of externalities is based on named prices. So I smoke, and I affect you, I affect you, I affect all of you, one way or the other, but not the same way. So in some sense, the shadow price, negative shadow price of my smoking will be the sum of the damages I do to all of you. But those damages are going to be person-specific. So therefore, those shadow prices are person-specific by definition. Then, of course, in this case, in the case of smoking, we just sum them up. But in the world as we know, how do we do it? We don't actually do the summing. At some stage, people get irritated enough and say, well, no smoking. That's it. You give up the right to smoke. And because the presumption is that those harms are sufficiently large that either you decide to allow everybody or restrict it or none, and then society has taken a position. But implicitly, that has a price tag to it. If somebody says, how could you do a thing like that? How about individual liberty to smoke? We had it 25 years ago. We had the right to smoke wherever we liked. That right has been taken away. And the answer has been, well, roughly speaking, voters felt that the total PI was too high. So we'll have to live with that. And I have no problem living with that because it's a good way to live. That is to say, not to have everything with a price tag to it. But it does fix the idea that there's a value of each of these commodities. And it will differ from person to person, and the commodity itself will have different features in different parts of the world. And that makes it really difficult. You're quite right, because trade and the kind of welfare economics that you and I are used to doing, of course, people are not part of the definition of a capital asset because it's all tradable. It's all homogeneous. So it'll be capital asset is a capital asset is a capital asset. Don't talk about location, don't talk about person, and so forth. Here, you just have to do it because that's in the nature of the beast. Natural capital has that feature. If nothing else, spatially, in some places which are polluted and other places are not that polluted. Well, it's a different capital asset in the two. The atmosphere is different. So I think this is to fix ideas, to know how to think about, like for example, I could answer the question of what happens when there's a breakdown of a natural capital in the foreseeable future because the pressure is too high. Well, then the natural thing to do is, well, let's see what would happen. Well, this comes to that, then its price is going to become very valuable. And that's what typically happens. Scientists say, look, this is in danger zone. Of these biomes, 24 biomes in the world that have been studied, 15 are in a bad way. And they're not saying that I know what the price is. They're simply saying they're in a bad way and better do something about it.
Yeah. The gentleman there in the fourth row in the corner, do you still have a question? You do, please.
Thank you, Mr. Dasgupta, for pulling out time and sharing your work with us. I think the question was asked earlier to you as well, that what do you think would make this entire process or scheme of things onboarded into formal economy or economic measurement? My question is, or I would rather rephrase it in a way, what do you think are the biggest challenges for onboarding this concept into economic measurement? Primarily so because many global leaders, as you would know, do think that climate change and a lot of other things are purely myth, right? So in wake of these things, how do you see acceptance of this concept in the formal affair of things?
Right. Well, as always, in every field of inquiry, things happen piecemeal. And your reference to climate change is very apt, because that's been the most significant part, significant literature on it, arising out of a variety of political pressures. And of course, it's a very urgent issue. That's for sure. One problem that I think an exclusive attention to climate change, as if you like, as a paradigm of environmental problems that the world faces, is that it has encouraged us to think of technological solutions. It's one where you might say, well, okay, so shall we have cleaner cars? Okay, and so forth. So that's a technological solution. Or there would be all sorts of earth scientists saying, you know, we'd try and suck the carbon back out of the atmosphere and then embed it and so forth and so on. Each of these is a technological one. When it comes to biodiversity loss, and some of the more momentous ones, because those are really significant, by the way, because if its species disappears, it's disappeared forever. So you might be able to substitute away from it, but it's not going to come back, so if you value it enough. Their technology seems to me to be of very limited applicability, and it has to be institutional. Like the smoking case is a good example. The route wasn't to have e-smoke, so to speak, although there is that now, but basically saying, well, you're not going to allow, you want to keep some freedom so you can smoke at your own place or something, but you can't endanger other people's health. So I think that's the direction we should be going. What are the challenges ahead? I think one of the first things to do is national governments ought to be really made to take it to task by their electorate to have a good inventory of their natural capital. The inventory that we have now of forest cover, as it was mentioned, is in a way we are free riding. Up there are these satellites which are taking pictures, and you can just free ride the damn thing. You don't have to do very much. But the real hard work will be actually penetrating the forest and seeing what's going on there. Who is there, who lives there, what the state of the forest is, and so forth. And of course, there's tons of other types of capital assets out there. Some you can measure, populations of species you can, especially the ones which have a tourist value to it, tigers, rhinos, that sort of stuff, that goes without saying. But I think the capital assets which offer services to agriculture, to general livelihood, that requires monitoring and actually having an inventory. And I don't have a great sense that countries have taken that on board. Never mind prices, just the quantities, and the quality. The amount of research funding that ecology receives is pitiful, absolutely pitiful. It's nothing, at least in the West. High-energy physics gets vastly great amounts. Cosmology gets a lot. Ecology gets very little, and yet those are the ones where you can't transfer your knowledge from one location to another because they are different. And so I think that inventory is not going to be costless, but it's totally essential, because otherwise you don't even know what you have. A society not knowing what it owns is not in a great place, as they say.
I have lot of hands here. The lady from that side, please. Pallavi? Thank you.
Dr. Dasgupta, I have a question regarding investments in human capital. And so we have a situation in India where there is obviously enormous investment in education, but how much is it paying off and how it affects wealth? In that, if you look at the army of educated unemployed, so they have skills which are not really in demand by the industry. So they have education. So how does that enter into your assessment, and how does it affect the way we measure wealth? Because if we are providing an education, but it's not really providing the marketable skills, then whether that distorts the wealth formulation.
Right. It's a very good question again. And the answer is going to be very unsatisfactory, because the methods that are being deployed are very unsatisfactory. They're unsatisfactory, but at least you know what they're trying to do. the intention behind it, never mind what the objective would be. Remember, we're looking at the means versus the ends. Now, you could take the whole of education and convert it into ends and saying education is a good thing, period. Don't ask. Everybody should be able to go to, Tony Blair's notion that 50% of school leavers should be able to, at least 50% should go to college. Never mind why. Okay. You could take that position. But if you use proposition, then you want to ask, where's the corresponding thing? The stuff that we are imbibing, how does that translate into an asset and that can be put on comparable basis to the other kinds of assets? And that's a very reasonable thing to do because you're investing on the one hand in education, on the other hand in buildings and so forth and such. And at the end of the day, you need to have some kind of a decision. And proposition is telling you exactly what that rule is. You do some cost-benefit analysis. Now, the way it was done was to simply say, well, education is a productive asset. So each year of college schooling or colleges and so forth is going to have an incremental value of that stock as measured by wages, salaries, and so forth. So the standard techniques that we've been using here, they're standard in the sense that doesn't make them right. It's just that we have nothing new in this. We are basically using that. Now, you might say, well, all right, suppose you have a 30% unemployment rate of youth. Then, of course, you'll take that fact into account in looking at the expected gain in salary, wages. That's how you do it. So even if the wages difference is substantial, if the probability or prospect of getting a job is only 70%, then you deflate that. Now, cuts both ways. You could say it creates frustration. And so maybe that education was in some sense anti-well-being, at least 30% of the time, not 70% of the time, because it's creating frustration. Maybe the person would have been better off if he or she had been investing in a different mode of asset, learning a skill of a different type, and so forth. Now, those mismanagements are bound to happen no matter what. And that would happen even with physical capital, because they may be in the wrong place. You might put a building in the wrong place. And only after it's been built, you say, my God, that was a lousy location. It could have been there because the roads aren't there. So that we have to live with that. But nevertheless, your question is right to say that education, maybe we are missing something by thinking of education only in terms of what it does in the, quote, income generating. On the other hand, if you live too long with listening to spiritual leaders, you start crawling back to economics. Because simply saying education is a very good thing, it's good for the soul, and so forth, it's just, after a while, it's all true, no doubt, but the fact is, it's costing. So I have a lot of sympathy for this way of doing it, so long as you know that it has real limitations. Okay.
Gentleman here in the front, please, right in the first row.
Sir Partha, absolutely wonderful, fascinating lecture. I want to just take you a little bit out of India here and ask this question. A friend of mine just became the head of something called Seabed 2030. And in that context, I was informed that we know more about outer space than we know about what's in the oceans. And so when you said, we need to understand better what's in the forests, then there's 3/4 of the earth is oceans, and there's very little knowledge of what's happening in the oceans as well, and I'd like to get your views on that. And also on what did you think of the Paris Climate Treaty, and now what do you think of the danger that it might be in?
In what?
Of the what did you originally think about the Paris Climate Treaty?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Was it a good thing, and what do you think now, or where are we headed in that?
Right. Thank you very much. Of course, I would totally concur with you. Some of my closest professional colleagues, like Jane Lubchenco, whom I've worked extensively, these are aquatic ecologists, and the reason I kept on banging on about the forest and not the wetlands as opposed to the oceans is that this is within the national jurisdiction, and you can do something about it. The oceans will really require serious international commitment. Otherwise, it's gone to the dogs. The amount of stuff we're dumping into it is just horrendous, as I understand. And I'm only quoting others. It's not my field. But people like Peter Raven, Paul Ehrlich, Lubchenco, of course, is commanding person there. They don't even begin to know what's out there. It's only recently that you are able to send material out there to take photographs 5 miles deep, 6 miles deep. So the answer is yes. It's just that there's not very much any particular nation can do in the Mid-Pacific or Mid-Atlantic. That's why I was ignoring it. Paris Accord, I'm the wrong person to ask, because I have friends of both types, some who are ecstatic. Jack Sachs tells me it was fantastic. And I talked to my old student, Scott Barrett, who's arguably the greatest expert on the subject. He was very disappointed by it. It's very hard for me to say it, largely because many of our worries have to do with at least an understanding that I received from the climate change expert that I have, is that it's too late. Even if there is zero emission now, we're heading for a 4-degree in 30, 40 years, by the end of the century, a 4-degree increase. Now, it comes back to the question the gentleman had asked before, when it's what? We thought in terms of 2 degrees. Well, that was a political decision, but it wasn't completely political. It had some basis on limited extrapolation from the past to say that within the zone of ignorance of what lies ahead, we haven't experienced 2 degrees. So it's not as though there's a hell of a lot of fossil records out there telling us exactly what would happen. And usually these extrapolations are linear ones anyway. So for 1 or 2 degrees, they're willing to do a bit of linear one and then put a lot of noise into the system to get some kind of a band. 3, 4, they get really nervous, at least the ones I talk to. They don't really know how bad news is, because there are a whole lot of these tipping points that are lying in wait, and tipping points are real. We have seen that in many other cases, other kinds of systems. So the Paris Agreement, as I understand it, you will get 2 different answers depending on whom you ask. And I suspect, on the whole, depending on whether the person was actively engaged in advising or whether they were not. The ones who were not were disappointed. The ones who were felt rightly that something is better than nothing. But I would be the wrong person. I have never really worked on climate change. Thank you for asking.
All right. We will take one last question from the front here. Professor Somnathan.
So thank you, Partha, for a fascinating talk as always. My question is, I guess it's, I'm going to ask what I believe might be a bit of a difficult question, which is that the endeavor here seems to be that you expand the notion of wealth to include things which have been left out. That's the theme of your lecture, that we have left out things that are important. But I wonder whether when we do this expansion, we run into the following difficulty, which is that we tend to add in those things. So you gave a list earlier, and some of those things were sort of the easier things to measure, like the timber value of forests, but not the ecosystem value, the oil and minerals. But then there are other assets, particularly ecosystems subject to thresholds. And we don't know exactly where those thresholds are. And it's very hard to sort of explore where those thresholds are. You don't really have data, and you don't want to conduct the experiment, because if you find yourself over the threshold, you're doomed. So then, if you want to add those in and count them as part of your wealth, you face the difficulty that the shadow price is going to vary a lot for even small changes in the quantity of the asset if you're somewhere near the threshold. And if you don't know how far you are from the threshold, then there's a great deal of uncertainty about the appropriate price. So that being the case, you don't want to sort of count it in here. So you see the difficulty that the things that you can add on to your accounts, into your accounting system, are the less important things. The things not the things that you're most worried about. the things that you're most worried about are precisely the things that would be very hard to add into this.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, in that case, isn't it kind of misleadingly reassuring? Like, for example, the numbers you gave us, I wonder if those numbers are sort of misleadingly reassuring precisely because you've left out the things that are uncertain and, that are subject to these irreversibilities.
Sure. Absolutely. Very good question indeed. No, I don't think that's misleading at all, just the reverse. Unless you point out that object, you don't even know in advance where the uncertainty lies. You're saying, yes, Partha, but what about PI of there, but you've already pointed to something. And this one is doing that. So that would be my first port of call for justifying this, that yes, you do want to have a tight theory in which the right things go in, because if you didn't have the uncertainty, just suppose for the sake of argument, that you had some subjective probability distribution, never mind all the philosophical difficulties that are there, they're not historical, and so forth. But you do, so these PIs are going to be based on subjective probabilities. At least I have a theory which tells me how, in principle, to go about it. And then, of course, in practice, we don't. But let me put this, I'm totally in agreement with you that it's entirely possible that you will be tempted to ignore the really difficult things. But I would argue you're tempted not because I've got a formula here. You're tempted because that's how we all are. We like to avoid the tough things. And if it's difficult, we're going to do it. But now let me put the same thing to you in a slightly different way. So I talked about this inequality and called the right-hand side net investment. But remember the questions numbers 4 and 5, which had to do with project choice, policy. Now we have a very, very good, and I'm a bit surprised people haven't actually picked that up, as to where does that come in? I mean, after all, we have a perfectly good way of thinking in principle of selecting projects and policies. We have present discounted value estimates. We say, here's a project, build a road. It's going to destroy a bit of the forest here. Okay, yeah, but on the other hand, people will be able to travel from here to there and so forth and so on. So you write down, you have the inputs and outputs of the project up for the next 30 years. You have estimates of the investment outlays and everything, and then there'll be some intangible benefits and so forth. And you do present discounted value calculation. Now, we do that. Now, even having done that, we, of course, say you can't take that seriously because you're thinking of prices 25 years down the road. There's a lot of conjecture here, and there are missing things. The project report does not have many things that should be there. So I could be asking exactly the same questions as some of you have asked with regard to good old-fashioned project analysis. The question is, how is that project analysis related to this inequality? The answer is, that's exactly what this inequality is. This inequality is, it's saying net investment needs to be positive if wealth increases. But a present discounted value of the flow of profits, when you add up these flows, you're getting a stock. So the PDV is a value of the change in the stock of wealth brought about by the project. And we say don't accept it if it's negative. Which means wealth has declined as a result of taking it. So this system is very generic, as I say, but it raises the same questions as in the project case, that there will be things that will be missing, and we're doing that all the time. I mean, think of this incredible barbarous behavior in Brazil that we've been experiencing throughout my lifetime, at least the last 30, 40 years, of roads being built because there are mines to be had, enjoyed right in the middle of the... and you can say, yes, well, I remember talking to one of the ministers some years ago, to the Brazilian thing, how can you do that? Say, well, my people need jobs. Well, that's, of course, a conversation killer. How can you say, no, your people don't need jobs? But it just makes you feel third-rate even asking how you could do things like that, because we want development. But the fact is, of course, it's been absolutely ruinous. And the projects, presumably, the reports didn't have the devastation that was being caused. Never mind the aborigine, the people living in the forest, but I mean the natural capital that was being washed out as a result, or the conversion of the forest into plantations. Same problems arise, so don't they? And I don't think I have anything to add to what we're already doing, except that we should keep on banging on about it. Saying the trouble is that it's one where you're always caught, people like us are always caught on the wrong foot. Because the onus is on us to point out there is something significant missing. The onus is never on the decision maker to say something is missing. Well, they'll say it's all very well, but we have to have jobs, we have to have, and people want to be able to travel. So you tell me where I'm going wrong. And then, of course, that's when you have to put in a lot more essential work. But you're quite right. This is terribly difficult stuff. But on the other hand, we're talking about life and death. So it should be difficult. Okay.
With that, I'm going to actually bring this meeting to a close. The finance minister has messaged me twice, and he's still caught up in his debate. He has not yet finished defending the budget. It's a matter of jobs, of course.
Of course. Is he having a hard time?
I'm sure he is. He's in the Rajya Sabha, where his party is not in power, not in the majority, and so therefore I'm sure he's being given a tough time, and he has to sort of give the last statement. But that apart, he has expressed a desire perhaps to see us tomorrow in his office. So I think we may have a small chance to convey some of this to him tomorrow. Let's give Professor Dasgupta a big hand. Partha, you were going to share a personal note, and I'm curious to know what that is.
Okay, I will. Thank you very much for reminding me. That's the trouble that happens with this kind of, probably these PIs and the KIs and so forth. So the Director General pointed out that I have a family connection to the Institute, and then I pointed out that Mr. Deshmukh was a family friend, not my friend, nor my father's. I don't think they'd met, but my brother-in-law worked under him, and they were quite close. But I have a personal reason for being particularly pleased to be here, the invitation of Shekhar. So these are, how does one choose what to research on? It's extremely difficult to answer. Back in 1988, Shekhar was at the World Bank at that time and was helping to organize the annual, I think it was one of the first annual World Bank conference on development economics. ABCDE, they call it, Annual Bank Conference on Development Economics. I think it may have been the first, or maybe not the first, the second one. I didn't know Shekhar then, but he asked a very close friend of mine, Karl-Johan Mailer, who was visiting the World Bank, and I think Karl-Johan probably talked to Shekhar to say, what about having something on the environment? So Shekhar said, yes, what a good idea. And so Karl called me, I was at Cambridge, and we agreed to do that. Now the drafts that was circulating to begin with, I suddenly realized I didn't like it. And I felt that if I was going to do it at the World Bank, this is the first time I'd ever been asked, and maybe the last time, I ought to do something seriously good. And I spent thinking about environment and the context of development. And as these things happen, which are very difficult to explain, I think I wrote one of my best papers. Certainly is in my collected works, and it's the one I'm really very proud of it, because it tried to connect rural poverty to the natural environment, and recognizing that much of it was not privatized, and yet it wasn't going down the tube necessarily, that local society, communities had, they were smarter than we economists in having invented institutional checks and balances to protect them. And Shekhar was very, very helpful. I think he liked the paper very much, and he gave quite a bit of prominence to it on the occasion. And so I've always felt indebted to you for, if you hadn't asked me to write it, I probably would have done this kind of work anyway, but there would have been a phase difference. So that was my private reason for being very pleased, and I pointed that out to Shekhar. He had forgotten it.
Thank you, Partha. That's, again, a wonderful way to end this C.D. Deshmukh lecture. His brother-in-law, of course, is I.G. Patel, or was I.G. Patel, somebody we, of course, think of with great fondness, and as another India's most eminent economists. With that, I draw this evening to a close. Thank you very much, Partha. I think you opened our eyes and ears to a whole new set of thoughts about how we should measure our intergenerational well-being. And with that, I welcome all of you to the reception outside and dinner. Please join us. And again, thank you very much.